First of all, I have to say how thankful I am to be here. Honored too. For me, it's my first trip on the east part of Europe. So I really do appreciate your really warm welcome, at least what we've received so far since yesterday. It's really great, and it's really pleasant too. Yes, few words also to introduce myself, just to explain you a bit from which perspective I'm going to speak. And you will see I will try to make a bit of an overview of what's happening currently a bit at the international level, on the level of markets, products, and consumers. But I will also tell you a bit of what's happening in Switzerland, the country where I'm from, because you might have heard that there are a lot of discussions about this cannabis regulation for medical or non-medical use. Also willing to say, yes, I'm a doctor, but I'm not a medical doctor. So you don't need to come to me for prescription. I'm a doctor in political science, trained in sociology, and I've been a research scholar and academic in public administration for about 10 years at the University of Geneva. I was not working on cannabis. I was working on the motivation of public servants, totally not the subject. But on the other hand, I was also working on public policies and how policy and policy practices do evolve in different types of context. I got into this cannabis issue, discussion, business, craziness, I don't know how you define this, in around 2014-15. I was doing my postdoctoral studies at Columbia University in New York City. And what happened in 2014, in January, the Colorado and Oregon opened their recreational market. It was something crazy. And at the same time, of course, it was Uruguay that was opening the recreational market. So for me, as a sociologist and policy scholar, it was very amazing to see how the administration, because that's my topic, how the administration would deal with this illegal system. We all know cannabis is illegal, cannabis is prohibited. We don't have the the presentation about the international regulation, how it impacts the national states on the capacity to have their own policy about cannabis. But what those two, the states one and the Uruguayan case showed, it's possible. It's possible to modify and change the way the states, the politician, and the society manage to organize things around cannabis. Cannabis and maybe other type of drugs that are currently illegal. So what we're witnessing now is like a profound transition of going from a substance, a plant, a material that was considered illegal, and gently entering different types of systems and society through the way of legality. This journey, for me, it's how I envisioned this, was also a bit, how to say that, a bit disturbing. I'm an academic. I hope I have some kind of a rational mind. I didn't know much about drug policy before. What I did as an academic, try to read what's being discussed. Where does it come from, this prohibition? How do different types of governments deal with the drug issue? And the first thing I learned, in drug policy, there's no rationality. All the rationality is somewhere else. How to understand the rationality? The rationality might be in the very specific causes of prohibition. the prohibition was not about protecting the people. I mean, protecting the people from dangerous drugs that could harm them, which is a totally rational thing. No, prohibition in the 60s, and we all know that. It was some political, economical interest behind that. Discrimination scheme. It was an American story filled with violence, discrimination, racism. We all know the story. So understanding the cause help us to understand what's the current situation. So understanding that the very, very basis of prohibition are very contested, and it's very bad that we don't have the Kenzie's presentation, because he could also show you and explain it to you that even in the international legal frame, this prohibition is not so strong. The scheduling of drugs has the very, very first intent to allow medical use of dangerous substances. Of course, it has to be controlled. Of course, it has to go through different types of administrative layers to comply with this international setting. But it's possible. Set up a national agency, have your product registered, and you can sell them on the market. That's what several countries does. So what brings into the reflection is also this idea that the very categories that are used to define those drugs, for instance, are also social constructions. And there is a very, very, very straightforward example about that. Who knew the difference between cannabis and hemp? And what is the difference between cannabis and hemp, actually? The percentage of THC? I'm sorry, I don't understand. The percentage of THC, okay, let's do that. But is it rational? Why not? But why do some countries take 0.2%? Why some other countries 0.3%? Some other 0.6%? Some other 1%? Isn't it to discriminate the same thing? So we can see that those categories are blurred. As much as the categories of consumers, for instance, the categories between medical consumers and non-medical consumers. Those are also bureaucratic categories, because the bureaucracy, and I've been long enough in public administration scholars to know that the very specific word of bureaucracy is to set up categories and processes. You have categories of people, and that open up some rights or whatever, these type of things. So what goes into this reflection, meaning that all those categories are also socially constructed. And what does it mean, socially constructed? It also means that behind, there's not like the science that fall down from the sky and says, this is how it is. It's people like me, like you, interacting in specific context and having to find solution for our problems. For instance, in Switzerland, for a long time, we didn't have the division between hemp and cannabis on the basis of a percentage of any active substance. And if you look into the international regulation, you will not find any threshold. You will not find any cutoff point telling you there's the bad marijuana and the good hemp. That's not how it works. So for instance, going back to the Swiss example, during the 90s and early 2000, we had what we called a gray market. What was this gray market? There were no distinction between intoxicating cannabis and industrial cannabis on the basis of this THC cutoff. It was the differentiation was based on the purpose of use. So you could plant, grow cannabis with high percentage of THC. But if you don't use it for an illegal usage, it's perfectly legal. And several countries do have the same process of thinking, which means what? It's the destination of usage, of the usage per se, which is going to be categorized, but not the product in itself. So we didn't have any cutoff point. Huge gray market. Maybe people know that we had like some international figures fighting for the regulation of cannabis. Most of them were hemp farmers. Farmers, yes, rough farmers. And they were also a bit subversive hippies, like demanding the freedom to produce what they liked to produce. And obviously, produce a product that met a demand. I mean, Switzerland is on the average consumption rate in Europe, maybe on the higher third, but it's not like an outlier like France, for instance. And we've been self-subsistent for a long time. Of course, those farmers, they tried to push forward for a regulation of cannabis. And what happened at this very specific time is that there had been a confrontation between two drug policy issues. The regulation of cannabis on the one hand, and the adoption of, for what Switzerland is very famous, are the harm reduction measures. You might all know that our former president, Ruud Dreyfus, who's also part of this global commission that we've been discussing this morning, kind of conceptualized the 4 pillars measure. What happened in Switzerland at this time? During the 80s and 90s, we had a huge heroin crisis. Many people fixing. We had open places, open market, people dying in the streets, people dying from AIDS, hepatitis, and, of course, the associated criminality. People needed so much money per day to shoot that they committed crime. So Switzerland began to have like this very pragmatic approach in trying to solve the issue, entering public health objectives into this drug policy framework. The 4 pillars, as we call it, which is prevention, repression, treatment in case of addiction, and harm reduction. If you're using, you should try to use it with the less harmful impact. Those measures were experimented for more than 20 years in Switzerland, but without having a serious constitutional basis. Strangely, and you also know, or you might know, that in Switzerland we have highly extended democratic rights. So we vote 4 times a year on crazy-ass subjects, going to dangerous dogs, to retirement system, international fiscality, taxation system, whatever. So we vote all the time. But this specific year, in 2008, we had one major voting on the drug issue. That was what? Adopting the 4 pillars, the harm reduction paradigm, and legally regulating this obviously happening cannabis market in Switzerland. 63% of the population for the harm reduction, 65% or 8%, I don't remember, against the legal regulation of cannabis. Back to our categories. At this time, if you remember, we did not distinguish bad cannabis and good hemp on the basis of a THC level. You all know that Switzerland is not part of the EU, but we are within the EU. And after a little while, the EU said, hey, what are you doing in your little kitchen over there? Maybe it's time to have a bit more modern rules. So you should discriminate THC. You should discriminate those plants on the basis of the THC level. Okay, we do that. What happened? They took the 0.3%. It worked. 2 years. It worked 2 years because we had a strong industry of producing cannabis that was meant for the distillation of essential oils. Now it's more fancy to call that terpene, but it's the same thing. It's the volatile things that makes perfume. So we had this industry to produce essential oils, most of it for the agro-food business, for iced tea and things like this, beers. And the very specific authority that was in charge of surveilling the fields, they were sick of having to put fines on farmers who had plants that would go sometimes 1 year. Yeah, it's a natural plant. Huh? It's difficult to control it. So it's not the fault of the farmer if 1 year it's 0.4, even if he bought some regular seeds and this and that from an official dealer, and that the seeds were part of the European catalog, sometimes it goes a bit up. The authorities were not stupid enough to consider them as illegal criminals. So after a couple of years, 5 years, the administration in charge of that just proposed to the parliament to say, okay, let's put 1%. That's going to help our hemp industry to just continue the work that they do. At least it's going to secure them, secure the investment, and they're not going to be considered criminals. Okay. So now the threshold is at 1%. Things continue to evaluate around the world. Cannabis and medical cannabis began more and more obvious as a therapeutic alternative since the 90s with all the experimentation in California. And of course, all the global players within the cannabis industry, they're all somehow interconnected. They all know each other. They know the trend. They know the business. They know the markets. They know the consumers. So it hasn't been a long time for the Swiss hemp farmers to think a bit, yeah, okay, we have this 1% threshold. Maybe we can do something with it. So the medical advantage of CBD this time went more and more obvious, mainly through public discourse and media. We all know the cases in Colorado, this little Charlotte Figi, who recovered from epilepsy by using CBD. It's Charlotte Web. And now there's an international company, multinational company, that is based on her figure. The Stanley Brothers. So, of course, this type of news crossed the Atlantic, and the Swiss farmers that were growing hemp, they thought, oh, maybe there's something to do with that. What happened is that they began to breed, produce cannabis that was still 1%, less than 1%, but had substantial amount of CBD. And more than that, it has the same bag appeal as classic cannabis that any users can find in the streets or in coffee shops in those other places, social clubs, other places, dispensary, other places, pharmacy, other places. So they began to prepare their like R&D, we could say. And what happened is that in the summer 2016, there was one company that came to the Swiss authorities and asked them what? To be able to commercialize cannabis products under the tobacco law. Maybe you don't know, but in Switzerland, there's also another specificity. We have a huge bunch of multinationals. They have all their headquarters there. Maybe in the mining, maybe in the trading, shipping, maybe in the commodities, of course, finance, insurance, and all of that. But we also have all the big tobacco companies. And those tobacco companies, they were able to anticipate the competition, and during the previous revision of the tobacco law in Switzerland, they put a new category, which is tobacco substitute. No one used that before. But some smart, or at least market-wise, hemp farmer in Switzerland asked to be able to commercialize CBD flowers under the substitute tobacco category. Of course, the administration was happy to do that. It doesn't contain more than 1% CBD, so it's totally legal. It doesn't contain nicotine, so it can be classified as a substitute. You remember, bureaucratic categories. And it's interesting for the states because it's taxed at 25% of sales value, of course, plus the VAT, the TVA, the VAT, the tax, normal tax. So this entrepreneurial move opened the whole CBD market in Switzerland. 6 months after this first company market the CBD products, there were 4 companies. The Swiss federal authorities, they released, like, how we say that, a guideline, market guideline, explaining into which categories of produce you can commercialize CBD. That was February 2017. And now there's more than 600 cannabis companies in Switzerland. So there's a crazy boom. What does it explain? It does explain 2 things. First, bureaucratic categories are made of, but bureaucratic categories can also be used by different type of actors. Maybe it could be patient groups. Maybe it can be entrepreneurs. Maybe it can be some advocacy groups of different type of interest. So what shows this story is also that some smart entrepreneur, they kind of find the little hole within the system and make it possible for a larger economy to build up. And now, in the early, no, not the early days anymore, but in mid-2019, the market is fully internationalized. We have Canadians, Americans, Germans, and people from all over the world investing on cannabis in Switzerland. So, with this little story, I wanted to explain you that all these notions around the legality and the policy are flexible, somehow flexible. Of course, the renewal of, if you want, the renewal of this hemp industry in Switzerland has brought a new interest into bringing forward the legal regulation for any type of use. Because also in the meantime, we've had the medical program that has been developing. The medical program kind of opened up in 2013. The medical program is very highly restricted in Switzerland. You need to have your personal doctor making an individual request. This individual request has to be argumented. You have to show that you have used all other type of medicine. You have to show that it's the only type of substance that's going to heal you, help you, soothe your any type of symptoms, whatever. So this process is quite heavy. And for what? To access some cannabis products that are produced in one company, by one company, and sold in one pharmacy in Switzerland. Switzerland is small. I agree with that. It's small, but even though. So in 2013, the authorities, they were like, yes, maybe we should do something, because they were feeling that they had more and more demand. They were feeling that within the civil society, some advocacy groups were pushing forward for that. But also they were seeing what was happening abroad in different type of contexts, and began to understand that if it was relevant for some other national, it might be relevant for their nationals too. And also, and which is might be particular, but I'm not so sure about that, because we find that in every country, some doctors who are advocating for patients, not many, but influential doctors who are trying to see, yes, I have patients. They tell me that their own experiments with cannabis help them. We have a very famous one for multiple sclerosis, for instance. And so they were pushing for that. So they opened this medical system in 2013, and soon this program, I remind you, highly bureaucratic, with a lot of files to fill and all of that, to have what? An exemption from the interdiction to use cannabis as a medical compound. And quite soon, the program began to be overcrowded. I think now more than 10,000 people has been through the program, and I think there's something like 5,000, 6,000 currently using the produce that are being sold, that they can access through this type of program. And by coincidence, or not coincidence, I let you to your interpretations. There's been kind of a momentum where the medical program began to attain its limits. On the other hand, there's a huge pressure from this new CBD industry. And on the other hand, of course, we have this tradition of having a pragmatic approach with drugs and drug issues in Switzerland. So now it's moving, and it's moving forward. And what is happening also is that now we have also the new interest groups that are entering. Pharmacists, they never got interested into that. But now that there are some Canadian producers who sell GMP cannabis, they say, yeah, of course, if it's pharmaceutical products, why don't we sell pharmaceutical products? And I remember, we have tobacco, we have shipping and commodities, but we also have pharmacy factories and big pharmacy companies. So we all know that they are very eager. It's not a threat for them. Cannabis is not a threat. They make thousands of billions of, and the cannabis market is too small for them. It's not a threat, but they would be happy to have a share of it. Likewise for the tobacco. Look at what's happening in the US and in Canada, where the big cannabis companies receive participations and financing from tobacco companies. Look at what's happening with the alcohol. It's the same. So cannabis is not a threat to those industries, but cannabis is going to be a nice addition into their portfolio. And I think I'm going to end on that. And if you have questions, feel free.